Thank you all for coming. We have a fairly full agenda today, and these are the topics that we're going to cover. Mark and I are your hosts. Mark is from New England, District 25 Director, and I'm Paul Cuneo, the District 16 representative to the ACBL Board. We are doing this webinar in response to a task force that the board formed and reported out on in late 2016 that said that there were some areas of ACBL who were experiencing shortage of volunteers. And I have been volunteering for a lot of years with an organization called Executive Service Corps Houston, and it's one of 30 branches of Executive Service Corps around the country. And volunteer management is one of our practice areas. And Mark stepped forward to work with me in Kansas City on developing these things so that we could have a presentation about volunteer management. Volunteer management has really become a discipline and a practice area throughout nonprofit organizations, particularly here in the US and Europe, where they're lead for a lot of volunteers. We want to acknowledge that a lot of the material we put into the presentation was sourced from 501commons.org. 501 Commons is a nonprofit organization devoted exclusively to helping nonprofits with management topics. And in this case, we liberally borrowed from their material on volunteer management. But they have a lot of good things on the website, and we want to encourage you to refer to that at the end. We have some learning objectives today. We want to talk about basically the principles of volunteer management. And then the second, of course, you can see is knowing how to apply it. And then lastly, we want to make sure you know where to go to get additional resources. We all know that ACBL is powered by volunteers. You only have to go to a tournament or a club and you can see that there are volunteers engaged in lots and lots of tasks. So volunteers are critical to our organization. And as a result, ACBL simply wouldn't be viable if we had to pay for all the donated time. Our collective donated time is worth millions and millions of dollars to ACBL. One of the concepts that comes from the corporate world, and again, this is a concept that has emerged probably in about the last 15 years, is the talent pipeline. More and more corporations are concerned with how do they develop the talent in their organization to serve key and critical positions in management, as well as key individual contributors. And they start looking at people at a relatively young age in terms of experience and try to manage their careers to make sure they get into the proper exposures and can ultimately develop into the key and critical roles. We think that concept has a lot of applicability to ACBL as we think of some volunteers starting in clubs and the roles they might form all the way up to serving through the ACBL Board of Directors. So here are some key elements of the volunteer management program that you'll find when you go to 501commons.org and some of the other resources that you may be referred to through that website or other websites. We're going to go through them individually and talk just briefly about each and the key elements of it. The first is planning and policy. And all of us know who have managed tournaments, you need to have a plan if you expect to be successful. And that applies to a lot of things. Team input leads to better plans. We all have our flat spots, we have our strengths, we have our weaknesses, but surrounding ourselves with people to improve our plans is always a good idea. And so policies are also a good idea. One of the things we want to encourage organizations in ACBL to do is to create a volunteer handbook. And within that volunteer handbook, we'd like you to include things as the key policies around expectations of the volunteers and also position descriptions where skills and responsibilities are described. Excuse me. This is an example of a volunteer handbook with the various job descriptions that they have, and it is amazing at how many individual job descriptions that organization has put together. The next is around selecting someone to manage volunteers in your group, whether that group is a club, a unit, or a district. We strongly believe that someone who's in charge of that uh, duty and who sees that as their responsibility is going to lead to a better program. Finding the right person to do that, of course, is critical. When we think of some of the characteristics that we'd like to have in volunteer leaders, the most important is that they're people oriented. But in addition to that, you'd like them to be effective communicators. You'd like them to be experienced in many of the volunteer positions that they're going to be leading. And of course, they have to be well organized. Sometimes we recruit volunteers based on their skills, especially professional skills. Some of the examples are people who we ask to function as attorneys or parliamentarians. Sometimes they become our secretaries, our auditors, our treasurers, and our webmasters. In general, we do better if we recruit people that have good professional skills in each of those positions. Other positions require more generic leadership and skills, but all of them require the ability to communicate clearly and interact with people, and all of them need a commitment to excellence in getting the job done. Volunteers and what they want out of volunteering has also changed over the years. Today's volunteers are pretty impatient when it comes to people not being prepared for them. So it's very, very important that we're prepared for the volunteers when we ask them to do work. So these are some of the characteristics of volunteers today. And it's important to be reminded that volunteers are volunteering, one, to help the organization, but two, to satisfy a need of their own. And if we keep that in mind when we design our volunteer positions, we'll know that we really want to understand the benefits for both the volunteer and the organization. We want to get the right people in the right roles. To do that, we'll need detailed position descriptions. And of course, we found that ACVL has many detailed job descriptions for volunteer positions on its website. When we recruit volunteers, we do better if it's done on a person-to-person basis, rather than sending out email blasts and saying, we need a volunteer for this. People are far more likely to volunteer when they personally know their other team members. And to recruit skilled volunteers means that we need to get to know them as people. I find when I work with people in the bridge world, I am continually amazed at the background and experiences and the skills that so many of our members have. The person who makes the ask should be the one the volunteer will find it the hardest to decline. And that's a good principle in recruiting everybody from volunteers to board members. One of the things that's critical to have is the job description and the time requirements so that volunteers know really what's going to be expected of them. And of course, there needs to be training. In order for training to occur, it would be helpful if everyone had a detailed procedure manual for the tasks that are involved. I know that my unit, ACBL, Unit 174, had its procedure manual posted on the ACBL website so that other units could take advantage of that. And I'm sure you all have procedure manuals and things that you could share as well. But the key elements of successful training are the job description and the procedures, followed by on-the-job instruction by people who are experienced, some follow-up to answer people's questions, and then seeking input on how to improve both the training materials and the work process. Recognition is a critical topic. It's important for us to recognize volunteers, and that's probably the most important thing that we do is recognize and thank all of our volunteers. It's really critical that people feel appreciated, and there are a variety of ways for that to be executed. It's critical that we pay attention to this, and it's one of the most important things that we could possibly do. What I'm going to do now is unmute Mark and ask him to pick up the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And hooray for volunteers. That's the most important thing we're going to say. We really do appreciate the work that they're doing. Next slide. One of the things that we found in preparing this presentation is that CEOs across the board, across nonprofit organizations, have a real challenge in keeping volunteers from one year to the next. We found that as many as 1 in 3 volunteers decide not to volunteer for a second year, which is a real issue. As Paul had mentioned previously, the amount of money that we're talking about across the board is enormous, not only the ACBL, but across the board. Next. One of the things that we need to press on how to try to reduce our losses, if you will, and try to retain the people that we've worked so hard to recruit, to identify, and to train, is to develop a good coaching and feedback system. We've found through experience that people tend to work better when they're working with people that they trust and working people that they know have a very thorough understanding of the organization and how the individual's specific skills and their specific responsibilities tie into the broader pictures of the organization. So what we found is that it's very important to appoint a coach to help and assist and to guide the volunteers through their job, and that will not only help the volunteer understand his position, but will increase their value to the organization. Feedback and encouragement is very important. The bottom line is that everybody wants to do a good job, and as you can see by this slide, that these are the different ways that we can motivate and encourage people in our coaching roles. There is a challenge that we need to talk about, and I think that we need to approach this in a very positive way. But the reality is that sometimes volunteers don't meet our expectations. Sometimes, for whatever reason, maybe other activities going on in people's lives, unexpected conflicts, or perhaps a failure to appreciate the amount of time that's required or the specific skill set that might be required wasn't really fully anticipated. It turns out that at times there's some disconnect. If we can work through those issues, that's great, but sometimes we may feel that it's very important to have a frank discussion with our volunteers, and maybe it's in the best interest of the organization and volunteer maybe to look for another type of situation down the road that individual might help us out with. So far, everything that we've talked about is applicable to any kind of volunteer organization. Henry mentioned his work with the Boy Scouts. I mean, been involved with that myself. I know that many of you are involved with different charities and different types of activities with your alma maters and so on and so forth. But what we're talking about is how do we apply these different concepts to Bridge? And as Paul mentioned in his talk about the volunteer pipeline, we start at the club level. And it's at the club that we get to really know each other. We get to know the specific backgrounds of our players. We get to know about their specific skills and how they might tie into our organization. That's when we identify people that might be interested. What we found so often, all it takes is to ask somebody. A lot of people just feel that they really need to be asked, and that's something that we need to do. At the unit level, we have to appoint maybe a little bit of structure and have perhaps a volunteer leader who's going to help not only in the recruitment, but also the training and retention areas. And at the district levels, we can maybe take an overview of the entire pipeline all the way down to the club and units to see how we fit into a structure that would be perhaps geared towards a long-term growth for specific individuals. On the next slide, you can see the types of typical volunteer positions that we've identified, and these by no means represent all of the volunteer positions, but a pretty good overview of some of the different types of diverse tasks and responsibilities at the club, unit, and district level that one might be able to fill in. We're talking about the club level, either maybe a webmaster, the unit level as a board member or GNT NAP coordinator, and at the district level, again, for different types of meetings, meeting roles, or like we say, the attorney, the treasurer, and so on and so forth, the board members. For our work, we've looked outside and inside the organization. Our 501commons.org and the www.energizeinc.com are two great websites. We're going to send you this presentation. I really encourage you to go click on these different links because there's an enormous amount of information and reference material in both of those. Internal to the ACBL, we have these unit volunteer handbook and the unit president's book, as well as the helpful document links. And again, those are great resources for you, for your homework, if you will. Once again, Paul and I are going to be here to walk you through and help you with any questions that you might have along the way. Feel free to contact us directly, and here's our email addresses. Now we can open up to any questions, comments across the board.
Oh, this is Jane. I just want to say this is a fantastic presentation. I wish I'd had this 2 years ago when I was doing my first tournament.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Any other comments?
This is Sean. I agree with Jane. It's a great presentation. One of the problems we have in our area is that, first of all, we're all getting older. And we've had volunteers who volunteered for 30 and 40 years. And the good news was they did a lot of work. The bad news was they did so much that some people got out of the habit of volunteering or thought, oh, you know, Nadine, for example, Nadine does it all, so we don't really need the help. So we are faced with the aging population issue. People are burnt out. Some people say to me, don't ask, even new players, you try to get the new ones in, they say, don't ask, I did the PTA, I did my church group, I did this, that, and the other. All I want to do is play bridge. So this is our main concern right now, is just finding these people who haven't done it already and getting them involved.
Yep, we saw the same thing. Good. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Our issue up in Saskatchewan is we have my club itself is slowly dying. Everybody's either moving to a larger center or they're just dying off because of old age. And we're lucky if we get 2 tables in the middle of winter, because a lot of the people who have retired go south to the States for winter. So it's really a real struggle in PA. We are having some trouble at the district level to look for people to run regionals, which is a larger drain on the volunteer population. It's a struggle for us. And in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and Regina, it's a little easier because they have a large pool to draw from. In PA, where I live, it's not so easy. So volunteer for us is a big struggle. We just don't have the people.
Well, having all of us said that, this is Jane again, one of the things that I can say is that when in the presentation you spent some time talking about coaching and leadership, I can attest to the amount of work, and I know Paul and Mark, you all know Margot Hennings. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't been for Sean Stringer and for Margot, who literally walked me through long distance how to plan for a tournament and how to run a tournament. And those two were my lifeline and continue to be my lifeline. So having an experienced person who's there to train you and guide you and coach you and give you feedback is so critical. And I'm so glad that that's a core of this presentation.
Al, anything you want to add? Or Henry?
I picked up a few things that I think could be helpful to us, because being a new organization relatively, we don't have basically what you describe as a volunteer handbook. And I know in the recruiting we've done, although it's been quite successful, one of the things we have struggled with is when people say, well, what is the time requirement? And we say, well, you're the first one who's ever done this. So we don't really know, but we'll work it out with you. I think getting some of that, I'm going to call it bureaucracy or infrastructure in place, is going to be a priority for us to ensure the sustainability of the organization. And as we're now into our third year, we're starting to get a better handle on those things. Actually, the most distressing thing was the statistic about losing 1 in 3 of your volunteers each year. That really does put the emphasis on recruiting, but I would hope some of these other things can also help retention. And I know when Mark was talking about that, we have seen those examples where, especially I think in the bridge world generally, a lot of our volunteers are in the retirement ages, and circumstances change, interests change, health status changes. So some of that is just a reality that we have to live with.
Henry?
I didn't say a couple things in the beginning. I've been chairing a tournament. In fact, I have one starting in this weekend. It'll be our 33rd year. Retention of volunteers, as you said, it's a challenge. How do you keep them, keep the motivation? How much time does it take? It takes as much time as you're willing to give. What we have been fortunate is that we have a few core people that will eventually step up and do what needs to be done if no one else will. But yeah, they're getting older. It's kind of weird to be called one of the young guys, but at my age I am. That's 61.
That's a baby.
Our unit is the oldest in our district and probably one of the oldest in the nation, and we get younger when somebody dies, not because somebody new comes on. And we're seeing that everywhere. And we are, in fact, we had a meeting a few months ago after our regional last year and discussed what are we going to do in the future. We are, quite frankly, may get to the point where we can't run tournaments anymore because we don't have volunteers. I know other units have had that same issue. Amarillo, I think, is out of the business of regionals for that very reason. They have no volunteers anymore. And maybe we're headed that way, maybe we're not. It's hard to know, but certainly the information here is great and wonderful. And yes, it applies in Boy Scouts. Fortunately, over there, I have a lot more volunteers. It's a lot easier to get volunteers over there. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge. This definitely helps, and I hope we can continue to make it move forward. I mean, ultimately, the idea is to have games to go to, whether they be local games or tournaments or anything.
Great feedback. I'll say something real quickly and then turn it back over to Paul. I think did we hear from everybody first before I say anything? I think so. Okay. First of all, Jane, to your point, and to Sean, to your point, yeah, I mean, we know Margot very, very well, and Margot has been a mentor to me even before I joined the board, and Actually, I've had a lot of communication with her and her vacation. I've got a good friend who's working in Vietnam right now, as it turns out, and hopefully he'll be able to take her and a friend out to dinner at the end of the month. That'd be kind of an interesting switch on the small world of our bridge activities. But the reality is we are very much aware of the aging issues of our game, and this has really been a driving force in Paul and I pushing to try to get this brought up as a major talking point. And I don't know, I'm glad to hear that you appreciated the feedback and appreciated the effort in putting this together. But we really appreciate what you've done and are really grateful for all the work that you've been doing across the ACBL. And the challenges that we hear in different geographies, especially up north in Saskatchewan, are certainly troublesome, but they give us some great feedback. So we learn from this as well, and thank you very much. Paul?
Right.
Can
Thanks.
I just ask, this is Jane, can I ask another question?
Sure.
A couple of things that were in here I'm very curious about. Sean and I have for two and a half years been trying to find the time to do a tournament project plan. I have one for a sectional, but every time I say I'm going to do it for a regional, something else pops up, and I can't believe I'm saying it. This is my second regional coming up at the end of February, and I'm doing it based on my documents as opposed to a Microsoft Office project plan that I'm used to using. ACBL org/helpful documents have a quote unquote tournament project plan. I know you all mentioned project plans. Do we have access to any that we can customize to our own tournaments?
I do not know if they have it using the software that you're talking about.
Well, Excel is fine. I'm actually using Excel.
Okay, but I don't know that they have it in that either. I know that the procedure manual we posted from Unit 174 has a very detailed description for each of the committee chairs as well as the co-chairs and a timeline around when certain things need to be done that we use and update. If that's not on the website, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you the current version of that document.
Okay, was that Paul?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we have a pretty extensive tournament manual for District 6, but it can always be tweaked. They're put in checklist form, things like that. I would like to go back to something Henry said, if you don't mind. We have what I would call a pretty decent treasury here in District 6, but we have been finding for some of our events we can't get the volunteers and have had to pay people. This hasn't happened with regionals yet, but it has happened with some of the units here at sectionals. People aren't willing to do all the hauling and the schlepping necessary. And it happened with our GNT event where the tournament coordinator just didn't want to do the hospitality part of it. We had to pay somebody. And we were opposed to doing this, but we were sort of desperate. Our local site wasn't one like a hotel, you pay the fee and they clean up. We have to clean up after ourselves in some of these county sites, which means mopping the floor and taking the trash to the dumpster. And people don't want to do this. If you're playing in the event and you've played for 8 hours, you don't want to have to mop the floors. And if you didn't play in the event, who wants to come there at 8:30 at night to mop up the floors? So we had to turn to paying people. And I was very concerned that this was going to start us down a slippery slope, where people said, well, hell, I volunteered for 40 years and never got a nickel, and now you're paying somebody to do that job I did. So that's been one of our concerns. And also on the financial part, we don't have a lot of money for the sake of having a lot of money, but we do because we have feared that this was coming. And so we are very, very conscious about our costs. And so we try in every way possible to be reasonable. We don't want to just keep raising the entry fees, but that's one of our ongoing concerns is containing costs. And that includes, everything ranging from directors. Sometimes we feel like we have excess directors at our tournaments, to the hotel food costs, to all sorts of things. So this is another aspect of it. Once you start paying people, how do you ever get volunteers again?
No doubt that is a challenge, especially for what I would talk about or call perhaps unfavorably the menial tasks. Like you've said, mopping the floors or schlepping some of the stuff. And it's a fact as our population is on the elderly side with an average age of 72, there are people that aren't willing to do that.
Right.
My own unit, we used to have about half of our sectionals a year in community centers where we had to do that work. And through time, we've migrated to hotels where we pay the fee. And, I don't know how long, as you say, you can do that. But when you change the venue, then at least you don't have the issue of saying, why are you paying Sam to mop the floor when I didn't get paid for 40 years?
Right.
When you go in the hotel, it's, well, the hotel insists on having the labor performed by their people, and, that's built into the cost that we pay.
Yeah, and I just might add, Sean, up here we have all these grave markers, and they say, as you are now, so once was I. Both Paul and I, before we joined the board, were in your position as district president, and we certainly feel your pain. In our district, up in District 25, we have a modestly paid tournament manager, and that has some pluses and minuses, I have to say. And to Paul's point, we constantly run into the situation is that once you start to pay somebody for a position, people that have done it for free in the past balk at doing it for free if somebody else is getting paid to do those things. So it becomes a spiraling, problem. It's not really a good situation. All I can say is feel your pain. Okay.
Yeah. It worries us.
Yep. There's another slide, Paul. You're going to share the last slide?
Yeah. Before we do that, or as we do it, I want to give a kudo to Al Edwards. His London Bridge Club has a good website with lots of volunteer positions listed that you might want to refer to. So anybody who is organizing volunteers at the club level, just looking at his site and all the things they have volunteers there is a real encouragement to me. So we're going to send you the presentation. We're going to send you a link to a survey. We'd ask you to take the time to fill it out. Individual results, of course, are confidential. We want to thank you for participating in the survey and helping us improve the webinar. We want to thank you for your time and effort that you spent with us today. We really appreciate it. And so any comments you have in the survey about how we can do it better, we'd love to have them. So thank you very much, and we sure appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul, and Mark,
Thank you.
and everybody else.
Thanks, Paul and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.